minutes. Yeah. So thank you for attending. Maybe thank also Maram. Her latest book is What Gender is Motherhood? Changing Yoruba.
I'm glad I'm coming after her. There's not much to say. But let me just say a few things. One in Nigeria. And this particular association will have to be the successor to African Studies. African Studies, 50, 60 years.
We may be giving the microphone to the public, but before that,
you can stay. You can drop your bomb and then want to leave.
Questions?
Or should we do it? Okay, okay. No, you stay. And for the sake of time, I did not want to get into all of that. The rival, and they each bring a league. And in the process of fighting, Jamale Ndip. So that's what Jamale is. So now to really think of Jamale as this the rival is giving new meaning to the word, literally.
Isn't that beautiful though? Isn't that beautiful though? In a changing world, that language, because it's a living language.
Yes,
also.
yes.
Yeah.
So I don't see anything, sorry.
Go ahead. No, we actually need the mic height up.
As much as I understand what you guys are saying, in terms of the changes that are happening in language, especially the way we are generalizing language in a negative way. As much as I understand all of it, I also understand Wolof is a living language and it's a beautiful language.
Yes.
And I think in the course of our interaction with the outside world, because we also don't live in a
Close the phone.
in a vacuum. Yeah, in a vacuum. We live in
But for you, there is this tendency also to say that Africa is the best place. I think that's a very naive, lazy way of thinking about Africa. I'm really sorry. Our cultures and traditions were not perfect. That's not the point. I think the point is to say that we need to free ourselves from what we've learned from Europeans and the Arabs. And I insist on the Arabs because in Senegal we have a tendency to think that Islam is indigenous to us. It is not. And Islam brought us the culture of the Arab culture, which actually is the reason for many of the troubles that we have now. We have to be really brave enough to say that. And in Senegal, when you say that, you are in trouble. But that's the truth. Is that we have a legacy of Islamic imperialism through Arab culture, of Arab imperialism through Islam that we don't want to face. But for you to say that Senghor has done a lot of a good job for us, especially in the terms of a system of education. I'm the product of Senghor's system of education, where we had the same goal. We had to speak French every time. And that was under Senghor. So do not tell me that Senghor was really inclusive of our national languages. He was not. We did the same goal. You had to speak French every time. Unless you come home, you cannot speak anything else. That is under Senghor. So I'm not going to go into why he didn't do this, why he didn't do that. I'm just going to stop right there. And Africa is not a country, it's a continent.
Okay.
No, because that's what he said. So I just want to remind him.
Let me say a few words and then I hope we have time for a sort of round of questions. Thanks to Professor Boyce for her intervention. I appreciate your appreciation. However, before I get to the however, with regard to the word indigenize, I like the word very much, but I know that it's always loaded and people like to challenge it. And I have wondered whether the better word is endogenize. Endogenize. What challenge can anybody provide for endogenize? You must start from where you're standing. So indigenize, one can use them interchangeably, but I found endogenize very useful for many of the things I would like to do with indigenize. That's one thing. And Carol, I beg to disagree. with the idea that people have been challenging gender since the 1880s. Not that people haven't been challenging gender for a long time, but the kind of work I'm doing goes beyond challenging gender. I have talked about decolonizing, degendering, recovering our language in and of itself, even without gender. In and of itself, in terms of the fact that Yoruba is not Igbo, is not Wolof. We all have to do that work with individual languages. And I didn't see anybody from the Americas who was doing anything with Yoruba. Even the fathers who first wrote Yoruba, they wrote gender into it, right? So I see my work in more ways than one as very pioneering on that count. There may be other areas in which it is not pioneering, but as many more days go on, I marvel at the extent to which this book that I wrote 20 years ago is so current. And part of what I see in my work is part of what Maram was saying about how new words are being created and the words are being gendered and old words are being gendered in ways that they were not so. And people say, oh, it's a part of our culture. One of the ones that really struck me more recently in Yoruba spirituality, in Yoruba language, is that the word for a devotee of a god or Orisha is Iyawo, is the same word for wife, right? So if you're a devotee of a god, whether you are male or female, they'll say you are the Iyawo of the god. When you go to Brazil, wherever, you are the Iyawo of the god. And in my work, I use that to argue that the category Iyawo is not gender specific, precisely because it involves both bodies or all different types of body. That it's not a gendered word. But lo and behold, today I have heard that when new initiates are initiated into the religion, into the houses of the Orisha, people don't want to use Iyawo if you're male. They don't want to say you are the wife of the Orisha. Now they've created a new concept, which is not new because it's Yoruba word. They'll say Omowo. So you are a baby in the religion, as if baby is not gender. They don't want to use that. And this is all happening right before our eyes. And I just said, wow, I'm happy I had documented this process to the extent that somebody saw it and alerted me to this. That had never been done before, and it's important to do all that. Then, with regard to the whether codification is necessary in order to flourish, there's no way around codification in modernity. There is no codification of languages. And I say that from the example of Nigeria. Yoruba studies is many layers deep. The kinds of research that people will do in Yoruba, I just came from a conference, the kind of level of discourse is just amazing relative to other African languages, because Yoruba was codified. And so it has a standard way of writing. I'm not saying that we should be fixated because we're still tinkering with it. But Yoruba, we can do 2 million dissertations at many levels in Yoruba. And we can also teach our children Yoruba if we want to. But with regard to Igbo, of Chinua Achebe and all, that is the problem Wolof is facing, is the problem Igbo is facing. Igbo was never standardized. So they say from here to there we can't talk to each other. So I don't see any way around codification, especially if it comes from the ground up. If we're all involved in doing it with regard to Yoruba now, people are asking for more dictionaries and all those kinds of things. We need to codify in order for the language to stay and for the language to flourish.
I did not respond to your question, I'm sorry. Okay. But I do agree that in some level, the language we need to be open, because there was so much that was lost too. And there are some words that are contemporary that we don't have. So creating new words is necessary too, but it should not be done arbitrarily. For example, there is a group of scholars that think about how to say certain new words, like industry, for example. And people come up with the word ndefa, like defa, ndefa. You know that word makes sense, right? So we do not need to fight such a word. But what I'm talking about is the fact that words are misused and given newer meanings that actually inform the everyday life of people, such as in terms of gender. For example, if you look at the word jamale, any of you know the word jamale?
No.
All of you know, but those of you who speak Wolof, do you know jamale?
Yes.
What is a jamale? It's a rival, so it's a rival, but is that a direct rival? Not many people know that jamale is not actually the direct rival of the person. That jamale, if you look at the word itself, jamale, jamale. So there is a process. You're doing something, jam meaning to how do you call it? What is it? To hit somebody, but like it was a piercing thing, right? So like maybe to stab somebody, but then in the process you stab somebody else, right? So that's jamale. So in that sense, it's not the rival. It's somebody who's next to the rival. Do you know that jamale is the person who comes with the rival? When women were actually supposed to have, usually they had more than one suitor, and both suitors will come and they enter into a conflict and they starting to fight, and they fight with a spear or something. So the jamale is the league. The league is the person that used to accompany. You have to hear what I have to say, because it is as if the student has become the master or the student. I cannot continue to bow down. So I'm not the student anymore. I want you to understand that. But no. Let me speak now, and let you speak, please. There is this tendency for men, when they sit in an audience when we're talking about gender, to make it about themselves. And that's what the prof has just done. I did not challenge you. I'm challenging our usage of language and how patriarchal and sexist our language is, including Kochu Barma was a sexist. I've said it. Because we tend to idealize people like Kochu Barma, not knowing that Kochu Barma started his preaching or whatever it was in a context that is very sexist, especially with the legacies of the Arab cultures. This is something that we really lose sight of. Usually in Senegal, when we're talking about our histories and our genders, we're talking about the influences of the French. We are not talking about the influences of the Arab in our culture, which is actually right now our downfall. The way that we see Islam now has actually created this actually deeper patriarchalization of our cultures and our languages, and we need to be brave to say it. Every time we're talking about how our languages, our institutions are gendered, it's not about men that we're talking about all the time, and you don't have to always fight it back. That's one thing. The second thing is that Senghor himself was a sexist too. I'm sorry. Yes, no apologies. And yes, with religion, but then also knowing, being able to bend English and not being able to bend Wolof is a shame. So it is not something to be proud of. As a Wolof person, to say that I cannot bend Wolof, but I can bend English the way that Shakespeare did it, it is no accomplishment to me. I think that it is important that when we are talking about colonization and we're talking about actually the violences that were done to our cultures and our languages and our societies, to always try to stroke the back of the white man is what is happening in our institutions when we're saying, well, it wasn't that bad, this is what they brought us. They didn't bring us anything. Good. They took away a lot. And it is our task now to go back and dig for whatever little is left and use it so that we can recenter ourselves and make something of our existence based on what we have left from this violent colonization of our institutions, our cultures, our families, and everything. With all due respect, Prof. Thank you.
before we take questions from the floor, I would like to respond. I would like to respond to what the learned prof talked about. The language question. The language question. The language question is a huge question in Africa, in African studies. And the point to be made, whether it's from Maram or myself or even Ngugi, all of us who are talking about the importance of African languages, the problem is not so much that we use Western languages. That could be a resource. But alas, the problem is we do not use African languages. We do not use African languages. People cannot write Wolof in a grammatical fashion, even the people who say they speak it. They cannot write Yoruba in a grammatical fashion. And in a few years, and within certain generations of our children, even those who live on the continent, they are not speaking or using the language. And language is an epistemological issue. It carries so much of our knowledges, of our philosophies. We cannot afford to lose it. So I will remind the good professor that the problem is that people are not using those languages to write their thesis, to work with it in everyday life. And I'm always surprised that in Senegal, despite the fact that Wolof is so rampant everywhere, they haven't gone to the next level of using it throughout the school system. In Nigeria, people can complain that there are 2 million Nigerian languages. People always say that, just as a way of not addressing the issue here. So we do not use our languages. That is a problem. Then one more thing that I have to say, because whenever you talk about gender, people start bringing out proverbs and mythologies. They say, oh, my proverb said that women must always sleep under the table. We must put our feet on them. You see, it's our culture. That is so sloppy. Whether it's mythology or proverbs, those things cannot date themselves. It's no indication at all of when those things, whether it's the myth or the proverb, when they came into provenance. Because if you live in a patriarchal society or a racial society, the knowledge that you produce will have that stamp. So I'm not surprised that you can dig up Yoruba or Wolof proverb that will tell you that women are this or black people are that. Look, under what conditions have we been living? For how many hundreds of years? So that does not constitute evidence in and of itself. In fact, what it constitutes is that, yes, we have a male-dominant culture, we have a racially dominant culture, and my question is how to change it. And that's why we're here today. Thank you.
Questions here first, and then Professor Davis, and you'll be raising your hand for a while. Number 3, and then this way 5, and then Chef, you'll go 5. Should I do it back again? Okay, here. Professor Davis is running away. Is it on?
Yeah, I think, thank you both professors. I think this is great, and this is what we have been asking for. I'm going to just pick up and address the question of Coach Barma. I think Coach Barma was a fundamentally modern subject, so therefore he cannot, he can accept to some extent his capability of tolerance, I'm doubting it. But also who's Coach Barma? First things first, I just want to address also the question of epistemologies. And I think epistemologies themselves, when people talk about decolonizing, anything, gender, whatever, first epistemologies. Because epistemologies create ontologies according to Bruno, which creates narratives and discourses that justify our action that we do, our sexism, our racism, or anything. And I think the crucible for knowledge is universities. And our universities are very, very, very white and global. And I think what needs to be done is decolonizing them. Professor Samuel Gachenis says we have universities in Africa, but not African universities. Africanizing our universities is one thing we should do. Talking about women also, and one thing also, I think that last year's TIA's conference, a student came here with a shirt where it was written, "Cite Black women." Yeah, cite Black women. The Doctor of African Studies. And it was written, "Cite Black women." Yeah, I think, all that needs to be done is for epistemologies. Which also, I think, leads to, can lead to practice, but also it's not only also discourses.
Yeah, I think following what Mignolo said is that there needs to be a radical project of decolonizing epistemologies and modes of knowing and centering them for Africa in a very particular African way, so that we can begin to undo or unlearn what has been done. And I do agree with that, that Black women need to be cited more and more, especially by our brothers, especially because usually our work is really discredited by our own brothers. So I think the citing of the Black women is very important.
Yeah, and right, the idea of radical also needs to be I think people should know also that radical means coming from the roots.
Yes.
Not the Eurocentric understanding of radical.
Okay.
Yeah.
Exactly. In a contentious way.
We'll just take the...
Jamaicans said that Christopher Columbus never discovered America.
Oh, yeah?
Do you know Burning Spear? Yeah, Christopher Columbus is a damn blasted liar. He said he discovered America, but before him was the Arawaki Indian. So, and Maram, I think, it may be colonization, but it may be also the legacy of our ancestors, because I don't think Kochi Barma was ever inspired or his mind was ever twisted by the European to a point that he said, "Jigen sopalte bulu, love a woman, don't trust her." Actually, he did not take it from any white man. That was his own way of, appreciating women. And if you just go back to the story, you see what society did or what man did. One man went to the king, and the king pretended that he was just giving him a secret, and he told him, "Okay, don't say or I'll kill you." In the middle of the night, the man wanted to please his wife, and he said, "I am going to be nice to you. I'm going to tell you this story, but don't tell." He told his wife. 6 o'clock in the morning, the wife got to the well to draw water with the other women. And by 12 noon, the story was all over the village. And they said, love a woman, don't trust her. But the question is, who was the first leaguer? If you don't want to accuse the king, you're going to say the man who was just discussing with the king was the first leaguer. So why you tell me, don't trust the woman because she's always fibbing or saying things? That's not, you will react to all of these.
Of course.
I saw a phenomenon because when we were in secondary school, those young girls or boys living in certain areas of Dakar would say, "Je comprends pas l'Wolof." They cannot even say, "Je ne comprends pas l'Wolof." Say, "Je comprends pas l'Wolof." And all of them would be speaking French. But what I see on campus is quite interesting. In our days, you are a student. You spend the whole day speaking French or English. Now, on campus, you hardly hear any student speak French or anything else. Wolof all the time. Now, people are saying, well, this has a negative impact on their scholastic, but this is at least some change. They are no longer bound to colonial languages. They speak their own language. Now, the question is, what is our relation to those languages? Are we the slaves of those languages, or are we as free as Achebe, who can turn and twist the English language the way he wants? I always quote in front of my students, wisdom is like a goatskin bag. Everyone carries his own. Tell anybody, any American or any British person, tell them to translate this. They won't be able to do it because you need to translate it. Why is, wisdom so diversified? Because it's a goatskin bag. So what's in a goatskin bag? Every goat has got its skin with patches different from one another. When you want to turn the skin into a bag, you're going to sew it. The sewing pattern with your hands will always be different. What do you have in a Yoruba's or in an Igbo bag? Is it some tobacco to chew? Is it dry fish, dry meat? The content is different, the shape is different, the coloring is different. But it's still a goatskin bag. Just like saying, my father was right, somebody else will say, well, my father told me a different story. So you use the English language, but what you're translating has nothing to do with the English culture. That also is another side of it. We need to challenge ourselves and bring in new paradigms. Because if I tell you this, les toits des cases luisent tendrement, que disent-ils si confidentiel aux étoiles? The roof of a house are shining tenderly. What are they whispering so confidentially to the stars? Everybody's going to tell me that's from Senghor and that's personification. That's not true. That's not true. Because many of you would not accept that Senghor had two faces. Very Europeanized, but very African and very Senegalese. This has nothing to do with personification and nothing to do with surrealism. Senghor gets back to his animistic world. In the animistic world, everything is not under the control of man. The river has a soul. The tree has a soul. Even this leaf in the tree has got its own soul, its own anima, its own volition and spirit. So much as you, human being, you have volition and spirit, the tree has. So why do you say personification, which is absolutely anthropomorphic, man invading and controlling everything? You need to invent a new word and not use personification. He does not personify. He tells us the way in which we view the world. Volition from a man, but volition from things. Il faut écouter plus les choses que les hommes. Ouais, donc c'est ces efforts-là que l'on ne fait pas pour revisiter, mais recaractériser nous-mêmes. And I finish on this. You are supposed to give a talk. You just glued me and challenged me. You know I will be talking. One day, I finish. Okay. A few years ago, we had a very important event. That was the celebration of excellence. And we had this big meeting with President Abdoulaye Wade at Theatre Daniel Sorano. And there is this great professor, very intelligent, who gave a speech on excellence. I was sitting, but I was uneasy, and I suppose I was the only one. The reason why I was uneasy is an excellent professor from University Cheikh Anta Diop gave quotation for excellence, and all the quotations were culled from the works of Europeans. Are you sure Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba did not write something on excellence? Are you sure the Sheikh into our did not write anything on excellence? So you disserting on excellence on an African soil, and all the people who thought a little bit on excellence come from Europe. And you are a full professor at the university. Why didn't you challenge yourself and say, wait a minute, somebody here said something about excellence, but he didn't do it. And none of us made the effort to challenge ourselves in order to be, to be able to challenge the situation as it is. Sorry, thank you.
Of racism, and nothing is shifting, nothing is moving, and we're still there. I don't know what we're trying to do. And then when the presidential lecture was given, at the last meeting, they said no African woman had received the Herskovits Prize. But it turns out that one person had. And I remember my book was nominated and was a finalist for the Herskovits. I said, oh, okay, now I know why I didn't get it. Next time I'll bleach my skin. So maybe. Anyway, and then I think it's also true that no African scholar, woman scholar, has been given a Distinguished Africanist Award. And I say that because a lot of our foremothers are dying. And they've never received any of this stuff. Whose fault is it? What are we trying to do? So the whole issue of decolonization, you can see the different levels. Institutionally, linguistically, personally. I always talk about the everyday forms of decolonization. But let me stop here, and hopefully we can have a dialogue with it. Session that just concluded proved to be very interesting because it put us, what they call some senior scholars, senior women scholars from the US and a few from the continent. The conference put us together with graduate students in Nigeria, and that was so enlightening for me. I had 2 mentees. Each of us were assigned 2 mentees, so I was able to interact with these 2 young women very closely. And then I was able to read some proposals that people were putting forward in order to be selected as mentees. And one of the most interesting and shocking things about these proposals was that in my case, at least 30 students said they wanted to work with me. It was the highest number. I was flattered. But when you read their work, even if they are working about gender, I say, oh, Oyewumi has written this, that. They end their sentence, and the rest of the work, they are quoting Simone de Beauvoir. They've never heard about Carol Boyce Davis. They've never heard of Patricia Hill Collins. So when they say Oyewumi, calling my name, it's because it was in circulation. It has no bearing. Many of the students were Yoruba, right? They're working on Yoruba culture, but they just didn't see any way in which my work informs their work. And it was a puzzle to me. But I subsequently discovered, like so many of the other scholars, that part of what was going on is that there's a regulation, there's a way of doing research and writing your proposal in Nigeria, and it seems as if it's continent-wide. The institution and the professors insist, as soon as you select your research, that you must have a theoretical framework. You must have a theory. And so what do? You must quote a few dead white men, because they are the only ones with theory. You have not done your research, you have no data, you're already theorizing. So that's why even if you mention Oyewumi, I refuse to die so that you quote me. Because when I'm alive anyway, nobody sees me, right? So it was only outside of my meeting and that I discovered that this was what was going on. And then somebody started a debate online, and it turned out that it was not only the students who were required to do this. That part of the reason why it's done that way on the continent is that they want to show the governments funding them that they were relevant. And the only way you are going to be relevant is if you look to the West.
Yes.
Okay? So, do I have a few more minutes? So, what that brought to me then is in regard to my own work. Let me talk a little bit about my work. And it occurred to me, I said, when I was writing my book, The Invention of Women, it's about epistemology and all that. Imagine if somebody had insisted that my theoretical framework has to be Simone de Beauvoir or something. You know, my work has always been centered on discovering, recovering, and exposing our intellectual traditions and knowledges. I have also been concerned with the erasure and distortions of endogenous knowledge. My work is precisely about recovering and prioritizing indigenous traditions, and language is central in and of itself. But as a gender scholar, I even think language is even more relevant. Gender, by definition, is a system of classification, and therefore a mode in which knowledge is constituted. I remember one of the first sentences in my book, The Invention of Women, is that gender is an epistemological issue. It's a way of organizing knowledge. Thus, the focus on gender categories in my work is also about the constitution of knowledge. The global context for research and the production of academic knowledge is one in which concepts, theories, and concerns are determined by European and American experiences. Consequently, the unequal power dynamics between Africa as one region of the world and Europe and America as another is a huge factor that must be considered when conducting research and producing knowledge about Africa. Since Western categories and concepts are not necessarily transcultural or universal, it became clear that I had to engage with deeper epistemological issues about identities of scholars and the historical and social context for the constitution of knowledge. So in my work, when I started my research on gender, when I went to graduate school in the 1980s, I didn't know that there was a field called gender, but I was happy when I took my first sociology of gender class from one of the most established sociologists, because I was at Berkeley, and I was discovering things, and my eyes were always so open. When people talked about gender in class, women are this, women are that, and I kept thinking, where I come from, women are not like that. What is this? What is that? And one of the things that was most resonant to me, and I'll never forget because it shaped my work, is that one of the first things I learned in my sociology class about the category gender is that because of the misogyny and male dominance of society, men and women are separate. Men think that they are above women, so they don't like to focus on areas of convergence between men and women. For example, nobody wants to talk that all men and women have arms, or we all have a heart. People would rather focus on, well, we have a vagina, and you have a penis. Things that separate, right? Things that separate, because segregation of the sexes. Men were always above women. And that culturally, the way in which that manifests itself in the culture then is that cultures like to exaggerate differences, right? Not similarities. And I couldn't stomach that. I said, the culture that I come from, I've never seen it that way, at least in language. I discovered that in my graduate class, because before then I never thought about Yoruba culture or the language. In my language and culture, there's no word for son, there's no word for daughter. The words that we use for siblings is older sibling, younger sibling. The word for wife is non-gender, the word for husband is non-gender. So the language is non-gender par excellence. And so my thing was that if that claim is true, that cultures are always trying to separate men and women, at least at the level of language, Yoruba did not do that. Easy to prove. Stop somebody in the street who speaks Yoruba. So when I bring that to their attention, anybody who's been to graduate school in the US knows this, especially Africans, people from another culture. You say something in class, you're a minority, they'll stop for 1 second, and then they'll pick up where they left off, as if you haven't said anything. You know? So after I had engaged this Nigerian students this summer, I'm thinking to myself, suppose somebody had insisted that I must put my work within some theoretical framework. The Western language is so thoroughly gendered. Yoruba language is the opposite. We can quarrel about who oppresses women, we can fight over that, but epistemologically, at the level of language, Yoruba language did not do gender. So imagine imposing a theory on that. What would have become of me? So these were the kinds of things I was thinking about as I interacted with students this summer. But I have to be grateful to an organization that the Lagos Studies Association Conference. I think that these kinds of and I want to start by focusing on a few key words in our title. And I think that this is important because in teaching African studies and reading a lot of work that we do, I see huge gaps. I see a vacuum in the way in which people think about coloniality and colonization. I don't think we do enough with the concept of coloniality of power in African studies, especially from many of us who come from the continent. I have noticed over the years that when many Africans want to teach courses on Africa, whether it's history or sociology, people tend to start with the Berlin Conference if they want to talk about colonization and all. And I think that's highly problematic. And it's a gap in our epistemology. So I wanted to mention the concept of coloniality or power, much of which is coming out of Caribbean and Latin American studies, is the idea of the importance of 1492. That is Columbus's, the beginning of European conquest of the Americas. I think that in Africa, we have to understand that 1492 is equally important for us as Africans. And so the concept of coloniality of power, especially as articulated by Annibal Piano, is an important one. Because what that concept articulates so well and registers is the beginning of how white supremacy came into place. Without our understanding that we live in a white supremacist world, we will not begin to understand some of what Maram has been talking about. We would not really understand our dependency, especially as intellectuals. So we need to start from 1492, not start from 1884, which is the Berlin Conference, when Africans like to start their history. It's like 400 years behind time. So for me, it is important to make that link between 1492 and 1884, the Berlin Conference. And so that's where the coloniality of power comes in. And I always say that 1492, when Columbus appeared in the Americas, he came with a few Africans. Many people don't know that. There were Africans on those ships. We used to learn the names of those ships, right? There were a few Africans there. Of course, people never say Africans. They'll say, oh, slaves. I said, how do you know? Because by the time people start talking about Africans in the Americas, they'll immediately see any black person as a slave, which is not necessarily true. And I think that as Africans and those who study African, we need to pay attention. We need to do our research, even on that period in history, because it was as a result of the conquest of the Americas in which Europeans took over their land, and the need for labor for those lands, that's why they came to Africa to get Africans, to steal African labor. So I don't know why Africans will discount or refuse to pay attention to that history. More importantly, or maybe not more, but significantly, I always say that by the time Europeans appeared on the shores of Africa, again, by 1884, they were already post-colonial. What do I mean by that? I mean that they had already passed through colonization. They had benefited from African degradation. They had benefited from the stolen land. So by the time they were on the shores of the Atlantic and coming to occupy Africa in 1884, Africans were already degraded from their perspective. Africans were already degraded. So we need to pay attention to that history. Because in 1884, many of us said, oh, maybe we didn't know anything. But the Atlantic slave trade and slavery had been going on for like 300 years. So when these people came, they knew what they were looking for. So it's important to pay attention to that history that has set the environment of white supremacy in much of what we do. Of course, the whole idea of coloniality is not a new one, because Nkrumah talked about neocolonialism, but I think the concept of neocoloniality adds quite a bit, because it's not only about political economy, it's about almost everything. People talk about our common sense has become colonized. Our names have become colonized. Our languages are shifting in favor of Europe. So the whole issue of coloniality of power is important, and the need to decolonize. So what does decolonize mean? To me, it means to localize, to endogenize, to indigenize, to historicize. It's about recovery. It's about putting ourselves at the center of our own knowledge production. It's about unlearning white supremacy. Those are the various ways in which I think about decolonizing. And when we talk about the decolonization of knowledge, then, we always have to remember that knowledge is not given. It's not something you find. It is something that is constituted. Always. Always. It is constituted. It is mediated. Knowledge is never pure, because it betrays the context. It betrays the identity of the person who is articulating the type of knowledge. So in talking about decolonizing knowledge, we have to understand that we're agents. Whether you're in the classroom as a student, whether you're a professor, we're all agents. And I always emphasize that to my students, that if we understand then that knowledge is produced rather than given, then we will be more conscious of our role in creating knowledge the way we want it. So I also wanted to say that. And then I also wanted to quickly talk about this idea of reclaiming sovereignty. I started thinking of reclaiming sovereignty as the goal of decolonization. A few years ago, when I had to do a decolonial summer school in South Africa, and I was in the company of Latin American theorists, many of whom are wedded to the idea of decoloniality, and I agree with them mostly on many things, but I always had one problem. Whenever they talk about the decolonial and decoloniality, it seems so all-encompassing. I feel suffocated by it. It's as if there's no way out. But I'm also an African who also comes from cultures. Despite the degree to which we've been colonized, I know there are things that are outside of coloniality. I know that putting it that way is very crude, right? To say something is outside of coloniality or white supremacy, but we know. Our languages, for one thing, that's why I think that our languages are so important. Because today, people feel that Africa has created nothing. But nobody will say Wolof was invented in France. Not yet. I don't know about tomorrow. Yoruba is being invented in London by the minute. But so far, so good, okay? So, but as an African who also speaks African languages, who also comes to the continent, I always want to push back a little that there are gaps, no hegemony is total, and because it's important to have a way of getting out of that. But you can understand.
Ideals of power, procreation, and identity in the age of modernity. Palgrave Macmillan, 2015. She has garnered many prestigious awards, including Fulbright, Rockefeller Ford Foundation, and presidential fellowships. In 2014, Oyewumi received a Distinguished Africanist Award of a New York African Studies Association. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to listen to Professor Gay from Kaulak and Professor Oyewumi. Can you give them a round of applause?
As always. Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. The Prof hasn't said anything about what I do other than me being his student, so I'm going to remind those people who don't know me what I do. Other than being his student, I'm an associate professor of African and African diaspora literatures, and I teach gender studies, and I also do research on verbal art and language. So there you have it. The Prof doesn't, I know. Don't go, you stay. He and I is always like this. So I wanted us to really to thank you again for being here on this day. We know that there's a game, and those of you who chose to come here to show us love, we really, really appreciate it. So we're not going to take your time too long. We are going to talk for maybe 15 minutes each, and then we open it up to a conversation, because I think that's what's more interesting and more fruitful for this kind of gatherings. I'll start with a quote that comes from Oyewumi and some other scholars, just to set the context for this conversation. And I quote, "Currently, the call to decolonize universities, disciplines, social movements, and even knowledge itself resonates globally. Nowhere is the quest for social transformation more resonant than in Africa, and amongst peoples of African descent, given their centuries-old place in the unequal, unjust global system. Eurocentric epistemologies were foundational to the subjugation of conquered people and their continuing domination since the inauguration of the modern colonial system. Thus, the recovery of indigenous intellectual traditions is necessary as Africans seek to reclaim their sovereignty." And another quote, "Today, the call to decolonize universities resonates globally. One international group of scholars articulated the problem thus, I quote, "For far too long have we lived under the Eurocentric assumption that our local knowledges, our ancient and contemporary scholars and cultural practices, our indigenous intellectual traditions, or our stories or histories, and our languages are better given up entirely. Consequently, the recovery of indigenous intellectual traditions and resources is a priority task. So we want to set the urgency to decolonize our modes of knowing, epistemologies, our institutions and our movements, and our also daily life practices. Given this urgency, I will focus my intervention on the need to decolonize language and the need to decolonize the university as a central institution in the production of knowledge, especially in recovering African modes of thinking. I want to start with the university first. I like to tell stories in a comparative way in order to highlight
for the strong ties between us, but I should say the strong ties I've always had with my former students. I have never had an experience of meeting a former student and they're pretending that they never know me. Because that can happen to some teachers. It never happened to me. So they are very gracious, very respectful, and nice. I don't think I've always been a nice professor, because there are certain moments where there would be some torrential outbursts from me. But you remember, whenever such kind of situation happened, I would rush to enjoy the one who was selling sweets and buy a bag and give it to you as a way of getting reconciled. But the moments also I appreciate the most when some of you met my two daughters in the United States where they studied, and always saying, "Oh, this is Professor Sen's daughter. Do you know your father, the way he teaches? Ngugi Wajogo." So thank you, Mara. I think everybody knows you here, a former student of the Department of English, University Sheikh Anta Diop, and then transferring to Binghamton University, while being my assistant in some of the study abroad programs, and making the best of your time in the United States and becoming a very productive faculty, and developing a very feminist approach to things, but not contentious. And thinking about bringing your friend, but also your colleague from Stony Brook University, Professor Oyeronke Oyeumi. Professor, welcome.
Thank you.
I hope this is not going to be the first and only time you'll be visiting WARC. To make sure that you'll be visiting frequently, here is a flyer with my email address and everything.
Okay.
Yeah, as Madam may have told you, WARC is not very much endowed in terms of financial resources, so we usually don't give stipend to lectures, but I have a little something which I specifically chose for you. Can you show her? Well, you can unwrap it. It's Senegal, and you know that wrapper is definitely South Africa. So I hope you like it. No, you can unwrap it if you want.
I'm sure
You can show it to them. Yeah. Okay. All right. So it's yours. It's yours. With friendship. Right. So that topic, but Maram will come back to it, is reclaiming our sovereignty, decolonizing knowledge and recentering Africa and African epistemologies. Dr. Oyewumi is currently faculty at Stony Brook, as I told you, and here is a short introduction to her. Born in Nigeria and educated at the University of Ibadan and the University of California at Berkeley, Oyeronke Oyewumi has been widely recognized for her work. Her monograph, The Invention of Women, Making an African Sense of Western Gender Discourse, or Discourses, published at the University of Minnesota Press. I will be going there in 2 days. 1997,